Hello, everybody. This morning I'd like to run over the notes to the Hagar lecture, From Hagar to Deborah, plot and point of view. I wanted to pick up because we didn't finish Hagar last week, really. And so I wanted to bring a few more bits of information to the table and then talk just a little bit about the story of Deborah, particularly about the story of Yael and Sisera. So, as far as Hagar goes, John Thompson, in his volume Righting the Wrongs, which we've read his introduction, um, reviews the traditional status of Hagar for commentators over the ages. And he notes that, first of all, Hagar in interpretation is often looked at as playing a supporting role. And I think that's pretty much true for the way we would read that story. And there's a question about why it would be that way. He also notices here that there's unexamined potential in her story because of God's benevolent concern for her on page 18 in his book. His idea to question why the story is routinely passed over is a good one. And I think from my end, one possible reason is that the story minimizes the theological is minimized because of the theological understanding here that Isaac is the son of promise for Jews and for Christians. And so the story goes Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then beyond Jewish interpreters, it goes on to Christian interpretations, seeing this as the lineage of Jesus himself. On the other side of that, when you look at Islam, Islam looks at Ishmael as the son of the promise, and this is a pretty good sized difficulty. So it could be that Christian and Jewish interpreters minimize Hagar to a certain extent in order to avoid falling into a large discussion about which son is actually the son of the promise. For the Jewish community in particular, the idea that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob is the lineage is foundational. It's part of the very essence of Judaism, and hence we Christians interpret and take some of that along with them. So the idea of accounting for Ishmael as the son of the promise, it is a bit of a problem. Now, recent feminist interpretation would say, let's look at the story of Hagar. And in fact, Tribble in Texts of Terror actually does take a real good look at the story of Hagar from a literary and feminist perspective. It wasn't in your e-reserves at the beginning as an assigned text, but I thought some of you might be interested in finding it. So I did go and ask them to put that up in e-reserve. So if you want to read the story of Hagar from the Texts of Terror, it's now in our e-reserves, and I think it's worth looking at. The entire book, Texts of Terror, really points out some of the more awkward stories of women in the Hebrew Bible. Also, what Tribble has come up with is the idea of Hagar as a very fully formed character. She notes that Hagar is the first woman to be visited by an angel. She's the first woman to get the promise of descendants, which is a little more like Abram rather than like Sarah. So we have a correlation between Abram and Hagar as opposed to Sarah and Hagar here. Literally, she's a little more elevated than Sarah. And finally, he notices that she, is the first woman to boldly bestow a name on God. Sorry about that typo out there. An author named Jensen also adds that Hagar is the only woman to choose a wife for her son. So you could go through scripture and have a look for that, and you probably won't find another woman picking a wife for her son. And Williams states that Hagar is the first female in the Bible to liberate herself from oppressive power structures. And that's a really interesting way to look at it because Hagar doesn't appear to be a self-liberator when you read her story, and yet in her walking away from the situation and walking toward God, it's very possible that she did actually liberate herself, or with the help of God become liberated. What are we to do with this story of Hagar, which is such a good, round, fully formed story? It turns out actually Hagar is beloved by many believers because this story speaks of the power of the oppressed to envision a future that is different from the status quo. And in so very many ways here, because in the ancient Near East, to be away from a husband was to be away from life itself. And there she was on her own with a child and unable to take care of this child just on her own. So I would recommend having another read of the Hagar story and to be thinking a little bit about what do we do with this as an interpretive crux for the church today? How do we account for that? Because we look at this as a foundational, kind of a presuppositional idea that we have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, as opposed to Hagar, Ishmael. And so learning to talk about that, I think, could be a really useful kind of thing. Now, as for Deborah, Peterson has given us a great chapter here, and he's done a really good job with the literary understanding of the story. And his whole basis here for doing the story this way is the idea of point of view for interpretation. So, chapter 2 of Peterson is what you're reading this week. I wanted to add just a little bit here. One important subplot in the Deborah story is the story of Yael and Sisera. And in that story, there's an interesting question. If you read carefully toward the end, where in the world is Sisera's mother? Okay, Sisera's mother shows up at the very end of 5. And she turns out to be a fairly interesting character. So I took this question, the whereabouts of Sisera's mother, as a guiding question for a text analysis conference paper a couple years ago. So somebody didn't type very well this morning. It's found in week 4 overview under lecture notes. It's a bit technical, but it will provide a look into how this method can add to a close reading of the text, and I think provide you with a little bit of an understanding of how that idea of subworlds and different kinds of things are formed within the text. So with that, I will leave you to read, and we'll talk a little bit more at the end of the week as a wrap-up on the idea of the story of Deborah. But I hope you're going to enjoy taking Peterson and having a good deep read there of that, and then engaging in the actual prompt this week, where you'll go and look at the story of Yael and Sisera. Please do let me know if you have any more questions or problems with anything in the course. I'm finding that the links in the course are fairly hot and they tend to jump around a bit. So anytime you're not finding what you need, please do be sure to email or put a note in the course question form. So we'll look forward to talking to you again soon. Goodbye.